Welcome to AASB's webinar 2022 PARCA Survey Results. I am Tamia Hurd, AASB's Public Relations Coordinator and the host of this session. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. First, you may wish to disable your screensaver so your computer won't time out during the webinar. At this time, we have muted all lines. If time permits, at the end of this presentation, you can type in the chat box online to ask questions. This webinar will be recorded. School board members will receive 1 hour of credit in the AASB School Board Member Academy for participating today. These hours help you fulfill state training requirements. However, to receive credit, you must email the sign-in sheet to the AASB office after this call. The deadline to submit all sign-in sheets is next Wednesday, July 27th. If you don't have a sign-in sheet, send an email to membership@alabamaschoolboards.org. If you have any trouble during this call or while viewing the presentation, call customer service at 1-800-514-1317. Have the webinar ID handy, which was in the reminder email sent to you yesterday. Now, on to the webinar. Today, we have Ryan Hankins, Executive Director of the Public Affairs Research Council of Alabama with us. During this webinar, Ryan will share key insights from the year's public opinion survey, including Alabamians' responses on important education issues and current policy preferences. Ryan, they are all yours.
Well, thank you, Ms. Hurd, and thank you to the association for partnering with us on this project, and thank you for giving this opportunity to share with some of your members, and thank you all for joining me today. I do think we will have time for questions, so feel free to jot those down and be ready to share those toward the end. I trust that you can see, I think you can see my face, which is less interesting. I trust you can see the PowerPoint slides. If not, please contact that tech support. This is a fairly visual presentation, and I want to make sure that it gives you some value. So I'll begin with just a little bit about PARCA. Some of you may know us well. Some of you may not be familiar with us at all. PARCA, the Public Affairs Research Council of Alabama, is Alabama's first and only nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization, founded by former Governor Albert Brewer in the late 80s, to be the state's premier and really only nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with our mission of providing information to inform and improve the decision-making of public leaders, including all of you, through objective, nonpartisan research and analysis. We do that through program evaluation of nonprofit services at schools and government agencies, through policy research, through data analysis, and through technical assistance, working with schools, governments, and nonprofits to deliver their services. We pursue that work under our core value, which is that Alabama can do better. We may disagree on exactly what we should do, but we all agree that Alabama can do better in major aspects of public life than we are doing. We believe we can accomplish that through what PARCA calls sound public policy. We talk about sound public policy as different than good public policy. We think good public policy is subjective, meaning it's the thing that we like personally. We're less interested in good policy and more in sound policy, which is defined as you see on the screen there. It's policy that pursues a real issue rather than a manufactured issue. It's policy that is based on sound research, clear design, competent execution, honest evaluation, and continual revision. Those are nonpartisan ideas, and to the extent that we at the state, local, county level, and schools can drive toward sound policy decisions, we'll all be better off for it. One project that we do every year is an annual opinion poll of Alabamians. asking a range of issues about taxes, about state priorities, and about public education. We work in what we call government systems and process, how we make the sausage of government, of public finance, of workforce development, and in public education. And we do this particular project in partnership with the Alabama Association of School Boards. So I'm glad to share with you the findings of what we have done. We published the 2022 issue just a few weeks ago. This is a traditional phone survey. We call it a random digit dial of calling phone numbers of Alabamians. It's a majority cell phone line survey instead of a landline survey. Just a little survey education here. Alabama leads the country in cell phone only households. So when you see surveys in general, but particularly surveys in Alabama that are primarily or exclusively landline only, they're really not viable. Our survey is almost exclusively now cell phone surveys. About 60% were respondents responding to phone calls from our research staff or students that work with us. About 40% were previous respondents who responded to an email or text invitation to participate in a survey. We had 408 respondents, and that gives us a margin of error of about 4.8%. I will say, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes, it becomes quite relevant on one data finding. I will say that surveys are increasingly complicated to do. People are increasingly unwilling to answer the phone and to provide their feedback. These are important services of the state, but they're getting more and more difficult to complete with each passing year. The respondents that we have, we do what's called weighting. So we do statistical analysis to make sure our sample matches the demographic, racial, age, income, education profile of the state. And what we see in the response is an overarching theme. One, we see very little polarization. We see disagreement, but not polarization, which sounds surprising to our ears given the national conversation. Polarization is defined as when a majority of one group has one response and a majority of the other group has another response. So for example, if most men say X and most women say Y, that's polarization. Our survey finds, again, disagreement, but not significant polarization on these issues. And that's encouraging for leaders across the state. We also see very stable trends. We've done this survey for 15 plus years, and there are always some surprises, but we also see amazing consistency in Alabamians' responses over time, in spite of the national churn that we're seeing. So getting into the data, we'll start with state services. We always begin by asking respondents, what is the most important service the state government provides? Education, healthcare, public safety, and transportation or roads and bridges. And for the last 10 plus years, education has been the #1 service, ranked as most important. You'll see there the average was a 1.8, I believe. We asked respondents to rank issues with 1 being most important, 5 being least important, or 4 being least important. And you see the average was 1.8. So almost everybody indicated education the most important issue. You'll see a drop in healthcare as importance, that red line, that second line. I think that's a COVID reaction. A year ago, healthcare and education were almost equal as we were in the height of that wave of the pandemic. We've seen that fall off a little bit this spring. We saw younger respondents rank education as more important than others, but we did see a majority or a plurality of respondents rank education as most important. Plurality is not a majority. A plurality is the answer that got the most responses, if not the majority of responses. Democrats and independents are also more likely to rank education slightly more important than are Republicans. Low-income respondents ranked healthcare as the most important service. And here you'll see that percent, for almost 49% of all respondents ranked education as the most important. So the average was 1.8, almost half said it was the #1 issue. This is off 1/10 of a point of the high in 2014, but up 10 points from 2017. Again, younger respondents, Democrats, independents, a majority of those groups ranked education #1, and a plurality of Republicans, meaning more Republicans ranked education #1 than any other issue. So we see consistency across demographic groups, across political groups, age groups, and all Alabamians seeing education as the most important issue facing the state. We then ask, do Alabamians spend too much, too little, or the right amount on these public services? And what jumps at you off the top there is 73% say too little is spent on education in Alabama. 2/3 of Republicans, 90% of Democrats say that too little is spent on education. Women are slightly more likely to say too little is spent on education. 68% say too little is spent on healthcare. About half say too little on highways. About 47, a little bit less than half, say too little on public safety. Again, majorities of every group, race, age, income, education, say we spend too little on education, and large majorities of every subpopulation say the same about healthcare. So you'll see there that we really think we're underfunding essentially every major area of public services. We drill down a little bit into taxes. I'll start though with another project we do every year called How Alabama Taxes Compare, where we look at tax collections at the city and state level and compare those to national numbers. And what we know is that Alabama collects on a per capita basis the lowest amount of state and local taxes of any state in the country. Well, last year, Tennessee edged us out. So you'll see that chart there. Our collections of $3,600 per capita, a little bit ahead of Tennessee's. We're 49th in the per capita collection of state and local tax revenues, which means that those other states have a revenue advantage over us. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. That being said, 58% of respondents in our poll believe that people in other states pay less taxes, which in the aggregate can't be true. 58% of people in other states cannot pay less taxes, and yet we have less tax revenues per capita. So there's an incongruence between what Alabamians' tax burden is and what they think the tax burden is. You'll see there that that asks, what do people like me in other states pay? And you'll see on that, the bottom line, 29%, that green bar on the bottom row, say 29% say people like me in other states pay more, which is probably correct, frankly. But 35% say they pay the same, and 23% say they pay less. So that red and blue bar that totals 58% represent those Alabamians that believe other people in other states have a lower tax burden than they do. Since we have that lowest per capita tax collection, or second to lowest per capita tax collection this year, that again means other communities have more revenue to play with. And this graph shows that. This shows what we call the tax advantage. And you will see there that the green line represents how much more per capita the federal government, or the average state has. And then each of those secondary blue lines, how much more each state has in state and local funding to spend in Alabama. So what that basically says is, if you look at, say, South Carolina, If Alabama had the same per capita tax yield as South Carolina, we'd have $1 billion more in state and local revenues to spend on education and other public services. Likewise, if we had the same per capita tax yields as Mississippi, $1.3 billion more in state and local revenues to spend on public services. We have a bit more than Tennessee, but that's probably an anomaly for this last year and this year. We asked respondents about their relative tax burden compared to others in the state. The question is, do people like me in Alabama pay too much, too little, or the right amount? You'll see that trend there over the last 4 or 5 years. You'll notice that last bar, the green portion, 38% say people like them pay too much in state taxes. That's a 3% increase from the previous year. Taxes have gone up probably some, but not all that much. But we've had a 3-point increase in the percent of people who say they pay too much. About half the respondents say they pay about the right amount. 8%, down from 12%, say that they pay too little. Respondents with more education were likely to say they paid too little. This is about what we pay. The next question is, what do other people pay? Do other people pay too much, too little, or the right amount? Again, look at that, the last bar in those 3 bands. The first band is low income taxpayers, the middle band is middle income taxpayers, and the bottom band is high income taxpayers. And what you'll see there is a majority of Alabamians in 2022 say that upper income Alabamians pay too little in state taxes. And then likewise, you'll see that almost a majority, about 48%, I believe that low income Alabamians pay too much. A plurality of Republicans, that means more Republicans said yes than anybody else, and majority of independents and Democrats say those with lower income pay too much in state and local taxes. So you don't see polarization here, and you see some emerging coalescence around the idea that low income Alabamians are paying too much in state taxes. Because we've had a robust economy, increasing tax revenue, sales tax growth, we have budget surpluses last couple of years. So we asked, what should the state do with surplus revenue? And you'll see 59 or 50.9% say that we should reinvest that money in state services. 40% say reduce taxes. A plurality of Republicans say we should reduce taxes. Majorities of independents and Democrats say we should invest in services. A word of warning, again, I mentioned our margin of error at 4.8%. So that gap between 40 and 50 could be more like 44, 46. So this is a pretty even split, really, statistically. You don't really see a strong split either way to either reduce taxes or invest in state services. That being said, we asked if we did reinvest the surplus in state services, where should those dollars be? And you'll see 50% said that should be reinvested in education. About 25% said reinvested in healthcare. Again, Democrats and independents are more likely to say invest in education, and a plurality of Republicans say reinvest in education. This was a question we asked only of those people who said we should invest in state services. So if the respondents said we should cut taxes, we didn't ask them this question. So those that want to reinvest in state services, a majority want to put more money back into education. If you wanted to cut taxes, we asked you what tax should you cut? And a plurality, not a majority, but it got the most answers. A plurality said we should reduce or eliminate the grocery tax, the sales tax on food. Then the others were lower. Income at 19%, sales at 14%, something else at 9%, property tax at 9%, and others on down the way. So of those that want to reduce taxes, again, the plurality is reducing the grocery tax. Shifting to education, which I think is why you're all here. Again, I'll go back to a survey we did in 2018 called the Alabama Priorities Project, asking what were the issues that Alabama policymakers and rank and file everyday Alabamians thought were most important. And overwhelmingly, not just education, but K-12 education was the most important. 70% of respondents said K-12 was the most important issue, with an average of 4.38. So we care very deeply about education, at least on surveys. As a reminder, that concern is warranted. You've no doubt seen data like this, if not this own chart that we've shared in various contexts, that traces the rise and fall of our NAEP proficiency over the last 10 years or so. And you'll see the top two graphs are 4th grade math and reading, the bottom two, 8th grade math and reading. You see that red line where we were trailing in 2008, and by 2011, at least in reading, we had in 4th grade reading, we had met the national average, and then we began the slow and steady decline. So now here by 2019, the most recent issuance of the NAEP, we were really essentially last, even behind military schools and Puerto Rico in reading and math in education at the national level, and trailing Mississippi, which is that green, the yellow line you see there. You know, we can't have that. Earlier, we saw that 73% of Alabamians said we did not spend enough money in education. This puts that data in a trend, and you'll see we've had strong majorities believe that over the last 10 or 12 years. The high was 79. It's dropped from 73, from 79 last year to 73 this year. I think that's a COVID issue. You know, there's so much knowledge, or so much belief, perhaps not knowledge, but belief about the federal stimulus money in the K-12 system in Alabama, without really understanding the restrictions on those funds, what leeway school systems have and don't have to spend those dollars. So you know as well as I do, probably more than I do, that money is not really a blank check, but in the popular opinion, the systems are flush with cash right now. So I think you saw a little bit of decrease on that issue of underfunding this year. I think we'll see that pop back up next spring when we repeat this survey. So as analysts and as researchers, if almost 75% of Alabamians believe that we are paying too little for education, then of course we want to ask this next question. Are you willing to pay more in taxes to support education? And I wish you could respond to me now, because I would ask you to tell me what you think the answer here is. Shout that out. But you can't do that. So just think for a minute what you believe that is. What percent of Alabamians say they'd be willing to spend more in taxes to support education? So keep that number in mind, and I will tell you the answer is 72%. Groups almost always underestimate that number. We've consistently found high levels of support to pay more in taxes for education. In fact, it was 69% last year. So the number has increased by 3 points this year. Those Alabamians who would be willing to pay more in taxes to support education. Again, the researcher in me asks the next obvious question: what tax would you like to see increased? And therein is the rub. So a minority support paying more in property taxes. A minority support paying more in sales taxes. A minority support increasing internet sales taxes. A minority support increases in income taxes. So we have a scenario, again, where a majority of respondents say, yes, I would pay more in taxes to fund education. But no plausible tax increase has majority support. So this puts lawmakers, city councils, school boards in a real bind, where everyone, a strong majority, want to pay more to support taxes, to support education, but no one can agree on what tax should be increased. That is a no-win situation for policymakers. Supposing, though, I'm sorry, our next set of questions involve the simplified seller's use tax, or basically the online sales tax, the sales tax that online vendors, Amazon and whatnot, now pay back to the state. This question asked how those funds should be distributed. The question is essentially, should online sales tax revenues be distributed locally to schools the same way that traditional brick and mortar sales taxes are distributed to schools? And 80% said yes. This is a complicated issue to explain, but I think the issue here is one of fairness, and respondents kind of key in on that idea of why would one tax be distributed differently than others. So this is an issue, as far as voters understand it, they believe both taxes should be distributed the same way, and not one way for brick and mortar tax revenues and a second way for online sales tax revenues. Again, there was no real variation between subgroups, meaning men, women, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, black, white, high income, low income. All those groups were pretty much in agreement that those taxes should be distributed similarly as to brick and mortar sales taxes. We asked how additional education revenue should be spent. If that is through the online sales tax, through other appropriations or revenue growth, where should new education dollars be invested? And we see that just over 52% say they would support increasing teacher salaries and teacher benefits. About 20%, the next biggest number, say that those dollars should be spent to hire school counselors or otherwise support mental health services. Those with more education were more likely to support higher salaries, but majorities or pluralities of every group, party, race, income, gender, supported increasing teacher salaries and teacher benefits. Then we asked a series of questions about decision making. Where should decisions be made? What is the best level of government to make decisions about school funding? And you'll see there 60%, about three out of 5 respondents said that funding decisions should be made by local school boards. Majorities of every group held that. Republicans were slightly more inclined to say local boards than were Democrats or independents. What is the best level of government to decide discipline issues? Almost 70% said the local board. 2/3 saying that local boards should decide that rather than other levels of government. Again, all groups tend to say local, with Republicans having a higher ratio to say local government than other groups. You know, this is a fairly consistent idea in American federalism that decisions should be made at the lowest level. We don't always live out that, but we give lip service to that. This next question is a little different. This is, what is the best level to make curriculum decisions? And you'll see there that plurality, but not a majority, say the local board, about 40%, but almost 25% say the local board of education. This is a little thornier and a little more complicated. Older residents and Republicans are more likely to say that the local board should make that decision. But notice here, this is the only answer we've seen thus far where the federal government pops up pretty high. That's probably the only answer in this entire presentation where you see the federal government scoring that high. Alabamians have far more trust in the federal government to make curriculum decisions than they do in the state legislature. And then finally, school masking decisions. Again, a little more complicated. 38% show a preference for the local health officer, not the school board, not the state health officer, not the governor. So again, local, but a health policy expert, not an education policy expert. But putting those together, over half say either the local board or the local health officer. And really no variance in this across any subpopulation. So the totality of these say that respondents really want to invest the power, the responsibility, and the authority to local boards to make these decisions. With that, I think comes a challenge, because as Alabamians are more and more engaged in the kinds of decisions that school boards make, and that they want to empower or continue to empower local boards to make these big decisions, those school boards will become more and more the site of intense activity, intense meetings, intense elections. So those of you on school boards should prepare, I would suspect, if not already seen, prepare for more interest, more scrutiny, more intense feedback than you've probably had in previous years in your service in the school system. So with that expectation to make decisions will come more pressure to make the decisions that your local residents approve of. So thank you for your service. We had a question in the instrument that we quit asking, but I'll share it with you. We asked a question about the fate of the Literacy Act in the near term. This was asking our respondents, should those third graders who are not reading at grade level be retained or go ahead and be advanced the next grade in accordance with the Literacy Act? And you'll see 2/3 supported, as they understood it, the basic contours of the Literacy Act. We pulled this question once the legislature decided to delay those provisions for a couple of years. So this is incomplete data, but you see there a strong majority supported the basic idea of the retention provision of the act. We asked about voucher programs. Should Alabama allow vouchers for the use of state funds in private education or homeschooling? And you'll see 49% said yes, 42% said no, 9% said no opinion. Again, with our margin of error, this is a toss-up. It's really a horse race. You can't really say that Alabamians are really for or against vouchers. It's an issue that we've not really litigated in the public opinion space just yet. However, we did ask respondents, if Alabama does allow vouchers, to whom should those vouchers be offered? And you'll see a strong, almost 2/3 say all students. We asked, should those be available to only those in failing schools, to only those with disabilities, to just other groups you might self-suggest. And you'll see here that while it's basically a dead heat on should we or should we not allow vouchers, there was strong support that if we have them, they should be open to everybody, not just those in a certain category or group. And then finally, we shift to trust in government. So remember, the previous slides indicated broad support for education decisions made at the local level, with a little exception maybe for curriculum, a little closer issue on curriculum than other issues. These questions are about trust in the state government. And what you see here is 66% of respondents say that officials in Montgomery don't care what people like me think. That was true across every subpopulation, although interestingly, those in the Black Belt were a little bit less inclined to say yes to this question. And a similar question, people like me have no say in what the government in Montgomery does. Again, no real variance, but a little less likely to say yes by those living in the Black Belt region of the state. So these two questions, we really don't have faith in state government. We don't believe the state government listens to people like us, no matter our party identification. Last year, you saw Republicans more likely to say yes to this question than Democrats. So Republicans, have a monopoly on state offices, and Republican voters said they felt that the government in Montgomery did not listen to them, more so than even Democrats, which is a fascinating finding. So again, what you see here is broad agreement on big issues, broad agreement for supporting education, broad agreement for more money in education, broad agreement for more money in supporting teachers and mental health, not agreement on how to fund that, broad agreement in investing local boards and the health officers with decisions, and little trust in state government. That again creates a fascinating position for the state school board, for local boards of education, and the legislature. By definition, policymakers, you included, cannot both increase funding, increase tax funding for education, and not increase taxes. So if you can figure out how you can increase tax revenue without increasing taxes, you'll have reinvented fire, and you can lead us out of the quagmire we find ourselves in. So with that, I will stop and see if anyone has any questions. As you think about that, maybe submit some questions if you haven't already. I'll make a shameless promotion here for an event we have coming up. For the last 3 years, we've hosted the PARCA speaker series, inviting opinion makers and thought leaders to visit Alabama and challenge us with how they see the world and things we should consider. In 2019, we had historian John Meacham. In 2021, we had columnist George Will, and then in 2022, we'll have James Carville. He'll be with us in Birmingham on September 29. We'd love to have all of you join us. So with that, is there any questions or conversation? And if we have any, we'll have to help.
Thank you, Ryan, for that great information. I'm actually going to look now and check and see if we have any questions.
I'll also say that while we're looking, PARCA, we routinely do presentations like this on this data set, or on demographics or education data at the state and local level, and happy to speak to your board or to your community groups to put Alabama education performance in context, or look at issues facing your community. So if you have interest in that, please reach out to me. Our website's been on the slide deck, parcalabama.org, or the association can help connect us.
Well, it looks like we actually do not have any questions submitted. Let me see. Okay, I just got one in. Give me 1 second. Okay, the question is, to what extent do you think that public opinion on increasing taxes by specific source is malleable?
I think it is. I think you see consistency in responses that people want to spend more money. Again, not just in education, but you see that we believe that we underfund every major area of government services: education, health, public safety, transportation. So I think there's a disconnect. People like that we are a low tax state, And you see the result of that, we have less per capita revenue. At the same time, people think we should spend more in all these services. I think the opportunity there is one, to educate at a pretty granular level what other states have and do in these areas that we don't have and do at the state and local level. And also what kind of revenue increases are we talking about? You know, a sort of a broad, would you pay more in income taxes? You know, we say no. But a question, would you increase income taxes by X%, which would average Y dollars? I think we might get a different response. I think there may be some fear that if I say yes, it's just a blanket invitation to increase taxes with sort of no ceiling up there. I think the campaign here would be the way you do millages. You know, we want to increase a millage by, you know, so many mills to fund these issues. I think Alabamians are amenable to that conversation when it's very clearly tying a fairly discrete dollar amount to a very clear outcome. You know, we have trained Alabamians to think that way because state law and the Constitution require that we marry revenue sources with spending choices. So we've kind of been taught to think that way, and that's not bad. So I think that advocates and others following the way that you and local communities do millage increases, I think you can see some move on those numbers if we are very clear, you know, what kind of increase we're talking about, what that would be used for. And I think putting that in some national context, you know, if we raised our income tax by X percentage, where does that rank us in other states? And educating people, you know, frankly, you get what you pay for. And people are happy with what they're paying, not happy with what they're getting. So something will have to give there. I hope that's an answer to your question. Long answer is yes. I think that can be moved.
Okay, the next question.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to kind of keep on going here for a minute. You know, you saw the gas tax pass a few years back, and if you set aside the inflation right now, you set aside the political issues of tax holidays, I think from a pure policy making point of view, that gas tax was a textbook case in advocacy because you saw it introduced several years in a row. Introduced and it died immediately. Introduced and got a little traction. Introduced and got a little more traction. And you saw organizations of different ilk and different stripes coming together around that issue so that by the 4th or 5th year, it sailed through. Those people that were not paying attention kind of clued in and said, oh, they rammed it through, but they had not rammed it through. They've been doing basically classic politicking and building a coalition over years to change the mindset to raise taxes. Now, was that good or bad? That's a different question. Simply saying that's a way to look at how a coalition took the long view and accomplished something that had not been done in Alabama since 1992. So I think there are some models out there to look at moving the opinion of taxes in general and specific taxes when it's tied to a specific outcome.
Okay, our next question is, being a brand new member of a school board, how can I use this information and how would it benefit our school system?
I think one, I hope, sharing that with your fellow school board members, and we'd be happy to come make a presentation like this to you and anyone else on the call and tailor it to your context. I think it's helpful to understand the broad mindset of Alabama voters, Alabamians in general. We're not particularly adept at understanding federalism. meaning the different levels of government that make decisions. We don't really always understand what powers different agencies have, what levels of government have. So our opinions about the White House or our opinions about the legislature can often filter down to the school board. This data suggests that might not be the case, because you see agreement here on more money for education. You see agreement on putting money in teacher salaries. I think you see in this data opportunities for disparate groups, teachers groups, business leaders, different economic or income levels, and Black, white, Hispanic voters to find commonality on ways to advance education at the local level. So I think this data, coupled with the education data that we have at the local level, could really could help local boards, find a path to, one, build some momentum around some areas, and by doing so, maybe avoid other more fractious but less beneficial debates and issues that you will face in the coming years. So I think this really helps. I would hope helps you understand sort of the general mindset of the average man and woman on the street, and the average person who is watching and thinking about what you're doing, and who might show up at the school board meeting, one Tuesday night and want to pontificate.
Okay, we have another question. How many of the people in favor of higher property tax actually own property?
I can't answer that. We did not ask, but that's a great question. That's an easy thing to add if they are property owners. I think most people know that we have about the lowest, again, the lowest per capita property tax collections in the country, and a significant amount of land is owned by non-residents and by corporations. But we in this survey did not ask respondents if they owned property or not. So we could not answer the question, will a property tax affect them? In theory, it would affect them indirectly by increases in rent and other expenses if they're tenants. Of course, also raising property taxes, like income taxes, would require constitutional amendments. So those are both difficult taxes to increase or decrease. And changing those requires an act of the Constitution or an amendment to the Constitution.
Okay, we have another question. What about gambling and SMP, smoking tax and alcohol tax?
So we did not look at those issues on this survey. Alabamians tend to we looked at the gambling question about 4 years ago, and at that time, Alabamians were split on supporting forms of legalized gambling, primarily lottery. But again, there was high agreement that any gambling revenue should be spent on education. We did some work for the governor's office 2 years back looking at revenue projections. I think we projected somewhere between $600 and $800 million in annual gambling revenues were possible, depending on what mix of forms of gambling we took, which is a lot of money. But again, our education budget is $7 billion, $8 billion. So this is, about 10%. That would be real money, but it would not be the kind of money I think some people believe that would go into the Education Trust Fund. If all proceeds went to the ETF, I'm not sure it would be the game changer that some believe that it is. But we did not ask about that question in this instrument. Our smoking taxes and our smoking taxes are declining. They continue to decline. I hope you're still there. Are you still there?
Yes.
Thank you. My screen has done something wrong. You know, we've increased cigarette taxes, tobacco taxes, and that and other emphasis have had a pretty predictable economic impact. We've seen smoking decline, vaping has gone up, smoking's declined, and along with that, we've seen declines in the tobacco tax revenue. I can't speak exactly about the beer tax and alcohol taxes. They're relatively high. They generate a relatively high amount of money for the kind of tax that it is, but in the scheme of tax revenues, they're a small slice. We say, and I can share that slide, I've got a pie chart that shows you the tax collections that we have. One of our colleagues likes to say that Alabamians say they hate taxes, and that's not true. We love taxes, we're just not good at it. And what that means is we have a lot of taxes that are hard to administer and generate a pretty small amount of revenue. So if I can share with you after the call, share with you that pie chart, you know, there's 80 different taxes or revenues, and they're all very small slices, including alcohol and tobacco. Our biggest tax revenues are income, sales, and insurance taxes. So increasing random fees, increasing tobacco and alcohol would not really generate significant revenue to address some of these shortfalls.
Okay. Can you speak more to SSUT? That seems like an area that most folks don't understand and that they are open to increasing taxes in. Is this correct?
It's kind of a double-edged sword. It's a two-pronged issue. So we ask about increasing internet sales tax. That's a complicated thing because they're structured a little bit differently. You know, you're paying arguably, depending on your location, less sales tax when you purchase via Amazon than when you purchase at the brick and mortar store. So conceptually, those taxes could be increased, although that would require some legislation at the state level, maybe the local level, as well as new agreements with retailers. The secondary issue there is how those funds are dispensed. And I think that's where the bigger opportunity is. So, as you know, the counties and cities are, one, those revenues in the aggregate are distributed differently. So, cities and counties receive a smaller share of those online sales taxes than they would of a brick and mortar sales tax, which means the state is getting more. Then secondly, those taxes can be distributed locally differently. So some communities could go ahead and send the same share or the same percentage of that share to the school system, but they don't have to. So you have an issue of the tax rate is less, local receipts are less, and then distribution to the school systems could be inequitable. And those are, so you have national issues, state collection issues, and then local issues. So each one of those is a different set of issues to debate. What it has meant is, even though the rates are small, it's effectively new money in the state treasury, and you've seen significant, I mean, almost exponential growth in the state coffers, but that's coming at really the expense of local governments as we see online sales increase. So we're about to do some new work on this very issue, some new research with cities, schools, and counties to really help policymakers understand this and understand the trade-offs that policymakers are making when those dollars flow to the state and to the county or city versus the school system. It is a complicated issue, and I think will be very hard for voters to understand. I think it'll really need to be, it will need some smart marketing from PR folks that can do that better than PARCA does.
Okay, it looks like we don't have any more questions submitted.
Okay.
So again, we just wanted to thank you. We appreciate you for taking the time to present this important information to our members. And I also want to thank all of you for your participation. We hope you found this webinar to be useful. Stay safe and have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.